nanoHUB.org.
Online simulation, and more for nanotechnology.
Welcome. I'm Tanya Fultons, and in this presentation, I will act as your tour guide and give you a conceptual overview of the nanoHUB app publication process. In this overview, we will follow your code step by step through its journey to publication in nanoHUB. I will show you the key places your code will travel between, introduce you to some important terminology associated with app publication, and tell you what background skills you should develop before you set out on this journey. This conceptual view of the process will be helpful to have in mind before the next tutorials, where I will go through the specific steps in detail. Here, I'll begin by discussing when you can start the process, then introduce the various places your code will go on its journey. I will then show you the path your code will take as it is built, tested, and moved from place to place. This overview will show the steps of the app publication process when you use a nanoFORGE code repository. For those of you who are interested in using a GitHub repository, another presentation will go over the differences involved in that process. When can you start publishing a nanoHUB app? If you already have working code, that is a great time to publish it as an app in nanoHUB. You might already have code developed that is ready to share from a research project or from an educational module. Unlike publishing a paper in a journal, you do not have to start the process with completed code in hand. You can also start with just a concept and build your code as you work through the publication process. Either way, chances are that your code will evolve through the process. I'd like to introduce a few images that represent your code in different stages of development. This first image represents an early version of your code. The second image represents an updated version of the code that has a few modifications added, which you might notice as the stripes. The third image represents a later version of the code that has even more added features. This is also a good time to point out some background skills that will be of use. These include Bash basics for managing files and folders. For example, how to edit, view, move, and copy files and folders, and how to navigate through a file structure, as well as Git basics, including how to add, delete, commit, and push code, and how to deal with branches, whether these are intentional or not. Now I'll show you the places involved in the app publication process and that you'll access via a nanoHUB terminal. I generally use a terminal from a Jupyter Notebook session, but other terminals are available in the MATLAB or Workspace tools if those better suit your app. Your nanoHUB file space is where you will build, test, and revise your code. nanoFORGE is an app development space and code repository internal to nanoHUB. nanoHUB Apps is where installed and published tools reside. These three locations are always involved in publishing a nanoHUB app. GitHub is an external code repository that you may optionally use as part of the process. As you get ready to publish your code in nanoHUB, one of the first choices you will make is whether to select nanoFORGE or GitHub as your app's code repository. The sequence of steps is a little different for these two options. In this presentation, I will go over the process using nanoFORGE, and in a separate presentation, I'll show the process using GitHub. If you use nanoFORGE as your code repository or repo, the first step is to register your app in nanoHUB. This will create a template for your app in nanoFORGE. The template is a set of 7 folders and an invoke file that nanoHUB looks for in order to run your app. Details about what goes into these folders and how to write the invoke script are given in another presentation. Once you have registered your app, you will clone the app template into your nanoHUB file space. Cloning the repo from nanoFORGE creates a local code repo in your nanoHUB file space that is connected to the remote code repo in nanoFORGE. In other words, not only does cloning copy the template folders and files to your nanoHUB file space, but it creates a connection between the two code repos through some hidden files. Once your local code repo is set up, you will add your code. There are several ways you can add code to your local repo. You can build your code from scratch using your nanoHUB file space as a code development workspace. You can copy code into your code repository from another location in your file space. You can upload code from your hard drive into your local code repo. You can also clone a repo from an external code repository into your nanoHUB file space. Then, copy the code into your local nanoHUB repo. Note that it is possible to work with GitHub in this way without selecting GitHub as your app's code repo. Now we'll return to the overall process. Once your code is in your nanoHUB file space, you'll want to test it there to make sure it works properly in nanoHUB. When some of your code is ready, you can commit it in your local repo and then push the code to nanoFORGE. This updates nanoFORGE and synchronizes it with changes you have made in your local code repo. At this point, your code is considered to be uploaded. This is the terminology used to describe code that is in the nanoFORGE repo. If you are building your code from scratch in your nanoHUB file space, you will be modifying it day by day. Notice the updated stripes in the code. It is a good practice to commit your code often and push the code to nanoFORGE whenever you have completed a segment of work. This saves versions of your work in both repos as you progress. When the new version of your code is complete, test it in your nanoHUB file space to be sure it functions properly. When the code is working, push the updated code to nanoFORGE. Once you have all of your code working properly and are ready to publish, you should also update the invoke file that tells nanoHUB how to run your app. Here, the updated invoke file is represented by the brick-colored folder. A separate presentation gives more details on how to edit the invoke file. You will then push the updated invoke script to nanoFORGE. And now the code in nanoFORGE is complete and matches the code in your nanoHUB file space. At this point, your code is ready to be installed. Installing your code will place a copy in nanoHUB Apps, where you can test it one more time before final publication. You will submit a request for your code to be installed, and a nanoHUB administrator will usually respond within a couple business days. If everything is in order, your code will be installed and available to run in nanoHUB Apps, but with permissions set so that only members of the app development team can run the code. The next step is to test your code thoroughly in nanoHUB Apps to be sure it is working properly. It is possible that code that worked well in your nanoHUB file space will not work well when installed in apps. Sometimes the problem is related to the invoke script. If there is a problem, don't worry. There is a mechanism for getting help that is discussed in one of the next presentations. Once your code is working properly in nanoHUB Apps, you should set up your app's description page. This is where you provide information about your app and upload images and other supporting documents. These will be displayed on your app's resource page in nanoHUB once it is published. Details on editing the description page are given in another presentation. When your code is running and the description page has been set up, you are ready to request that your app be published. Again, this request goes to a nanoHUB administrator who should respond within a couple business days. When your app is published, it will become open to others according to the tool execution status you selected when registering your app. Along with your app being available to run in nanoHUB, if you designated your code to be open source, a zipped version of the code will be available for download. Congratulations! Your nanoHUB app is now published. Other people can run your app in nanoHUB, and you can monitor your app's usage statistics over time, and even see a map of places in the world from which people run your app. Over time, you may have some ideas for improving your app. You can start working on the next version of your app in your nanoHUB file space while the published version remains as it is. You'll go through much the same process as before, testing the new code in your nanoHUB file space, then pushing the new code to nanoFORGE when everything is ready. You'll request that the next version of your code be installed, and your code will be installed alongside the already published app and will be available only to the app developers. Once your new code is installed, you can test it in nanoHUB apps. Then update your app's description page with new details about the changes available in this new version. When your code is working and you've updated the description page for the next version of the app, request that your new code be published. If all is in order, the new code will be published within a couple business days, and while the previous code will still be there, it will no longer run in nanoHUB apps. Congratulations, the new version of your app is published. You'll follow the same procedure for making further modifications to your app. Thanks for joining me on this overview tour of how to publish an app in nanoHUB using a nanoFORGE code repository. There are additional tutorials that go over specific details for many of the steps outlined here. These tutorials include details on the following steps: how to register an app in nanoHUB, how to move your code through the process, how to set up the invoke script, how to set up your app's description page, specifying a license for your code, and how to update your app to a new version. There are additional tutorials on how to set up an app using GitHub and how to use nanoFORGE. Background resources and references are also available on Bash Basics, Git Basics, and using Subversion, which is an earlier version control system that is still used for some of the older nanoHUB apps. Thank you for coming with me on this tour, and I hope you'll join me again in the next tutorial.